Reprise du débat. Resuming debate. The honourable member for Carleton.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. This motion is about more than an airport. It's about unlocking the creative power of the entrepreneurial spirit for the betterment of our people. Entrepreneurship is nothing new in Canada. It built our economy. The lumberjacks of the Ottawa Valley who harvested the wood were entrepreneurs. So too were the craftsmen who turned it into farming implements and timber frame barns. The wood from these barns is ironically, Mr. Speaker, more popular today than ever before. Trendy coffee shops, restaurants, new homes use it as veneers, flooring, and decorative beams. Type vintage wood into house.com, a popular home design website, and you'll find 37,000 recycled pictures of recycled products that are used in the most beautiful ways. And it's not cheap. It can go for $10 a foot, more expensive than many engineered hardwood floors. Mr. Speaker, a few years ago, this wood was an abandoned barn, no longer good enough to house cattle, left as a home for rats and pigeons. Why is it suddenly worth so much? The wood's value is in the story it tells. A big old barn beam now on my fireplace mantle has axe marks that tell of the logger who cut it and squared it. Its mortises and tenons tell of the craftsman who joined it into a building frame that held for over 100 years. The rusted nails and the board remind us of the calloused hands of the 19th century Lanark farmer who pounded it into a barn, and his descendants who worked in it for generations thereafter. The story, that is the story that people buy when they purchase this reclaimed wood. And the modern day story of recycling that wood is also the story of entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurs like Tim Priddle, one of the owners of WoodSource in my riding, have taken the material that would otherwise have decomposed, a decrepit and condemned barn, and created something beautiful that makes people happy and connects them to their past. This is the triumph of free enterprise, and it's part of the $36 billion second-hand economy, according to a report sponsored by Kijiji just last week. Recently, WoodSource in my riding expanded and invited the community for a tour of their facility, where I learned the tale of two buildings. One was built 40 years ago. Back then, the government required a one-page drawing stamped by an engineer and a one-page application. And then, done, approved, ready to build. And if you think that's not safe, the building is still standing and in use today, decades later. Now, about 6 years ago, they applied to build another workshop, roughly the same size and dimensions. It took 1,500 pages of applications, $600,000 in fees, reports, and professional consultants. He had to hire an arborist to write a report on each tree being removed, including the size and species, this on a few acres of otherwise useless brush. They even made him pay a fee for the loss of parkland, even though the land had never been a park. You'd think it was a pulp mill and not a lumber mill, because half the cost of building it was paper cost. In fact, with the money he spent on paperwork, Tim could have hired another 10 employees for a year. Then comes the electricity cost. In the last 5 years, they've gone from $3,200 a month to $9,000 a month. Tripled. That's $70,000 a year in increases, enough to hire yet another talented employee. Much of the increase pays for subsidies the government imposes for wind turbines and solar panels, which produce only a minute fraction of Ontario's electricity, despite billions of dollars in subsidies that consumers like Tim must shoulder. He complained of these costs to his local Liberal minister, who said, quote, "I'll put you in touch with some people in my office who can help you with various grant programs that may be available." But why not just let Tim keep his own money? The answer is there would be no place for the Liberal minister. If you just let people succeed through their own hard work, that minister would not be so important. The entrepreneur would not need to come back asking him for his money. President Reagan used to say, "Liberals tax anything that moves." If it keeps moving, they regulate it. When it finally stops moving, they subsidize it. Such is the case with Bombardier and the Toronto Island Airport. The airport's runway is too short to land Bombardier C Series jets. A 400-meter expansion of that runway would solve that problem and would result in Porter purchasing $2 billion worth of Bombardier planes to land there. Yet, in a tweet sent out only weeks after taking office, the transport minister announced he was blocking this infrastructure project without any public rationale whatsoever. The result? They are blocking a massive infrastructure project at the same time as they plunge the country into deficit to fund infrastructure projects. They're blocking $124 million in economic growth in Toronto while spending billions of dollars of borrowed money, ostensibly, to stimulate economic growth. They're blocking $55 million in newly generated tax revenues while increasing taxes to get more revenue. They're blocking $2 billion in additional sales for Bombardier C Series planes and then proposing $2 billion in federal-provincial bailouts for Bombardier. They're blocking business people from landing in Toronto's business district, which puts more cars on the road between Pearson and downtown. And then the government says we need to spend more money to relieve traffic gridlock. And they do this to protect the privileges of the wealthiest 1% with waterfront homes near the island airport, at the expense of middle-class workers who miss out on the jobs, middle-class passengers who get less choice, and middle-class taxpayers who bear the cost. Elsewhere, they pledge to raise taxes on startups by doubling the tax on stock options, but they plan to simultaneously subsidize startups with taxpayers' money. Or again, they add a 9-month delay to an already 18-month approval process for a pipeline that will carry Western Canadian oil to Eastern Canadian refineries. Selling Canadian oil to Canadians means we don't have to pay to accept a discount from Americans, Mr. Speaker. As former energy entrepreneur Gwen Morgan wrote this week, this discount currently amounts to $10 a barrel, meaning we forfeit $38 million every day. That means the $250 million injection from the Federal Stabilization Fund announced by the Prime Minister in his recent visit to Alberta wouldn't even offset 1 week of market access losses. The pattern is this. The government is standing in the way of entrepreneurial opportunity. It is blocking development. It is holding back the spirit that helped build this country from the time of the settlers who built those barns I spoke of earlier on, Mr. Speaker. Seeing back allows us to see forward. And I know that trends in interior design come and go, but the popularity of this timeless old wood and the story it tells gives me hope that Canadians remain committed to the same common sense, ingenuity, and work ethic that make our country great. And I believe, Mr. Speaker, that this government, with time, will be forced to reconsider its decision to block this important economic opportunity for the people of Toronto and the people of Canada. And when they do, Mr. Speaker, entrepreneurs will celebrate, the middle class will celebrate, our aviation sector will celebrate, and all the people of this land who love to go and visit Canada's biggest city by landing right in the heart of the downtown district, they too will celebrate, Mr. Speaker. I look forward to celebrating with them. Thank you.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Spadina, Fort York.
I'll give the opposition credit. They're getting closer and closer to the facts. The previous speaker, two sessions ago, said that the runway extension was 353 meters. Sorry, 335, then corrected to 353. Now that they've reached 400. The actual number is 500. If you'd read any of the reports, you'd know that. But clearly you haven't. Clearly you haven't. The second issue is this.
Just a point of order, if you don't mind, the Honourable Member, I'll just remind him that he is speaking through the Speaker and not directly across the floor.
But the other point that's being made here is that they keep talking about the fact that this is a cost-free proposal. The reality is it's going to cost $1.2 billion to squeeze an airport the size of the Ottawa International Airport into 1/7 the landmass. And one of the criteria for the city to study this, that the Port Authority had to agree to, was that they would pick up the cost for the expansion. The Port Authority has said, no, we will not pay for this. We will not pay for this, which means it was then turned to the Government of Canada at the time, the previous Conservative government, you have to pay. And faced with a choice in the New Canada Building Fund, they did not choose to put the money into an expanded airport. They chose to put it into transit in Scarborough. So where does this government expect to find this money if the previous government couldn't find the $1.2 billion to expand this runway? It needs to be expanded by 500 meters. And the cost of doing it and building the landside infrastructure is $1.2 billion. The previous government balked at the price. Why would we have to spend it?
The honourable member for Carleton.
Mr. Speaker, we did not receive an application for a $1.2 billion expansion because the plan, of course, is to fund the expansion through the Airport Improvement Fund, which is paid for by passengers. We in this country have commercialized our airports, something that happened about 25 years ago under a previous Liberal government, and it was a wise decision because it put the cost of airport improvements onto the users who benefit from those improvements. And the improvement of the Toronto airport, the Billy Bishop Airport, will be funded in a similar manner. No one is applying for a federal grant in order to build an expanded airport, Mr. Speaker. In fact, the reality is, if the member really believed that the airport couldn't build it without a grant, then he wouldn't have had to send his minister out to block the project in the first place. They could have just rejected the application when it arrived. Why wouldn't they have waited for such an application to arrive on the desk? The truth is because there was no need for such an application. This number that he is using, $1.2 billion cost, is a number that he is inventing, because he is he is speaking for a very tiny minority of very well-connected and very wealthy people who do not want to see this expansion go ahead. And it is unfortunate, but they are doing it at the expense of middle-class taxpayers, middle-class workers, and middle-class Torontonians who will lose out as a result of the government blocking this opportunity.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Durham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and through you to all my friends in this House, including those in Spadina, Fort York. When I was starting my career, I lived in the Beaches area of Toronto and helped my friend John Tory run for mayor in what I call the version 1.0 campaign. And the bridge to the island airport was a big issue, and the subject of Porter. And the issue of noise often came up. And living in the Beaches, actually south of Queen, on the water, that issue was always conflated and exaggerated. In fact, after a while, people in the downtown of the busiest city with a vibrant boardwalk and waterfront, it became background, Mr. Speaker. I'd ask my colleague to comment on how the C Series, Mr. Speaker, the aircraft actually are impacted by this insider decision made by the government, is actually quieter and has the ability to operate. This is usually the concern people have, Mr. Speaker, is noise. It's unusual that it be in a city centre airport, because if people are downtown, they're not in the country, Mr. Speaker. But how can the C Series impact that noise issue that was the original concern with Porter's original operation?
You in 30 seconds or less, the honourable member for Carleton.
I reminisce myself about my time spent living a summer in downtown Toronto, and it is the centre of a major metropolis, Mr. Speaker. There are sounds there. One of the sounds that I rarely noticed when I worked there was the airport and the air traffic. And the member is quite correct that the C Series is renowned for technology that suppresses the noise and makes it more friendly to surrounding communities in which it lands and lifts off. And this innovation, of which the government claims to be such a great fan, should be encouraged rather than blocked, and that's why I'm pleased to stand today in support of the expansion of the Billy Bishop Airport. Thank you.
Resuming debate, the Parliamentary Secretary